gig labor. It's a big buzzword, the gig economy. It's here. It's a huge trend in the world and for us in the accounting industry. But what are the downsides and the risks when using gig labor that you need to be made aware of so your firm's not left exposed? Tune in to the latest episode of the Masters of Innovation on Evolve Now to find out.
Masters of Innovation. Looking towards the future with anticipation, raising up the technological conversation from the east to the west and all across the nation. If knowledge is the cure, then we got the medication. We're the masters of innovation, the masters of innovation. We're the masters of innovation, the masters of innovation.
All right, Joe, we're back. Another episode, picking your brain. What's the stuff we need to know inside a firm? I know for many firms out there, ourselves included, we're using more and more gig labor. But once we do, what are those things we're not thinking about, mainly insurance, cybersecurity, employee practices? What are those things that we got to make sure we've got our ducks in a row when we're using gig labor?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple things that I think firms really need to consider before jumping on the gig labor bandwagon. And the first one is going to be, first of all, check to make sure that your contractor actually has professional liability insurance. And we'll talk a little bit later about indemnification provisions, which sounds fancy, but it's pretty basic. But at the end of the day, the work should go out under your firm's letterhead. Right. So you're at least going to be directly responsible for the quality of that work. But now let's say that a claim arose from that body of work that was provided for by the contractor, say either in whole or partially. And you would then want to think, okay, well, hopefully you can go back against the contractor for the damages that they brought to your firm. And if they don't have an appropriate an appropriate professional liability policy, well, then, I mean, what are you going to go after their personal assets? Like, that's probably not going to happen. So at the very least, you want to make sure, hey, they have a professional liability policy. And then likewise, you also need to think about looking at your own professional liability policy. Generally, it's going to be under who is an insured under that policy. So look at the definition of insured, and you want to make sure that you also have, say, 1099s, contract employees, seasonal workers, various definitions under there that could be appropriate for the firm, kind of depending upon the circumstances of the work relationship you have. But you want to make sure that at the very least, that the professional liability insurance side is actually covered, or you could be facing some pretty uninsurable losses there, which would not be fun.
That sounds unpleasant, but yeah, it sounds like making sure you've got these different bodies covered. Now that you're using it, your policy is probably fine, but 2-3 years ago, you weren't using gig people, seasonal work, independent contractors. Make sure it's in there now. It's great. What's the next thing we got to know?
I would also check for, if you don't have one, now's probably a good time to get one. If you already have one, check it. But make sure that under your employment practices insurance, that if some claim arose from a contractor, that you're going to have coverage for that as well. So, generally it's going to be, you got to think, okay, some sort of like wage and hour dispute, or some type of sexual harassment or sexual discrimination. So let's say a contractor of yours goes out to a client workplace and there's some allegation of sexual harassment or sexual discrimination, right? You need to investigate, okay, would that be covered? And let's say you figure out, okay, that's not covered. Well, then maybe that's not the person you want to send out to a client worksite to start talking to people. So it can actually have implications on real world business practices that you have there.
That's great. It's something to kind of think about, that regular employee practice policy as well. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm sure there's more. So let's have it, Joe. What are the other concerns we're not thinking about?
So let's briefly jump into the data privacy world and talk about the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, it's pretty explicit when it states that, hey, you're responsible for the security of your vendors. And so with that, if you have a contract employee out there, you need to make sure that, one, they should have cybersecurity insurance of some type. But two, you need to make sure that they have appropriate cybersecurity controls on their particular system. Now, in a lot of times we're going to see, say, former CPAs, or I shouldn't say former, retired CPAs, right? And they're jumping back in the game and they just need something to kind of keep them busy, which is totally fine. I'm not against that whatsoever. But if they're holding your client's data on their system, there has to be appropriate controls that you're contractually obliging them to carry. Because ultimately, let's say the contractor has the information. Well, you're the data owner. They would just be considered like a data holder. So if that contractor, let's say they have a bunch of your clients' tax returns on a laptop, they leave that laptop in the back of a car and they go to a bar, and then that laptop gets stolen. Well, guess who's going to be paying for breach notification letters and credit monitoring and the forensics? And you're going to have reputational harm and your name could be in the news. So you need to make sure that on a practical level that they have reasonable cybersecurity controls, or whatever framework of laws that you would fall under, whether it's, various state laws or various federal laws, that they have those controls in place, and also that they have the cyber insurance in place, that if something does go wrong with the information they're holding, that you're not the one left holding the bag. And then you also want to make sure you have your attorney just kind of wrapping this all together. Make sure your attorney is looking over those indemnification clauses. And it sounds kind of complex, but the gist of it is, hey, if this contractor harms my business somehow, how are they contractually obligated to make me whole again? So that's very, very crucial. That's a great place for your attorney or your professional liability carrier. Hopefully they have that capability to look over that contract for you. That's a great time to get them involved in the process to make sure that you're not, unnecessarily leaving a hole unfilled there that could come back and be a very expensive mistake for you.
Yeah, Joe, that's one that you and I actually looked at before with a national tax gig company, that exactly the data was going out to the third parties, these gig people everywhere. They had no insurance or coverage. And it doesn't matter if they got hacked or accidental. They give their laptop to their niece who doesn't know what these files are, and she shares it. The exposure was astronomical for the firm, and those gig people had no insurance coverage. So it's not a part of, like, with these gig people, make sure you know where your data is. If it can stay inside your system, that's all the better for you.
Yeah. And don't just take someone's word for it that they have insurance. Because I'll say this, being an insurance guy, a lot of people have no concept of what the various insurances are, what the various insurances do. So, you may ask them, hey, do you have professional liability insurance? And they'll think, just being honest, like in good faith, they could say, well, yeah, I've got insurance for my business, but it's a business owner's policy, not a professional liability policy. Or maybe they're like, yeah, I do have cyber insurance, and it's like a little $10,000 endorsement on a business owner's policy that pales in comparison to the amount of damage that could be incurred with the number of social security numbers or other PII on their system that you're giving them in the course of their employment. So make sure, if you need to, ask for something called a certificate of insurance. And that's just a brief snapshot. It'll tell you, okay, what policies are in place, how much insurance do they have? And then from there, hopefully it's pretty straightforward. Yes, I have professional liability insurance as a contractor. Yes, I have cyber insurance as a contractor. It's in these two separate policies. If they don't have that and it's some type of endorsement, that's a good trigger for you to start digging a little bit deeper to make sure they have what is necessary under the contract to make sure that you're not left holding the bag when something bad happens.
And that's what it's about, making sure you as the firm are not left holding the bag. Something happens, even something unintentional. So, Joe, any other things we got to be made aware of when it comes to gig labor?
I would just say, once again, looking at that cybersecurity control posture, right? So one, you got to make sure that you actually understand what laws your own firm falls under and how that could then translate to the contractor, because that could be a fairly expensive burden for the contractor to make sure that they're staying up with all of the cybersecurity requirements that your business is falling under. So just start off with, okay, a lot of firms don't even know what cybersecurity laws actually apply to them to begin with. So, before you go out and you start making sure that vendors are doing the appropriate thing, make sure your own firm is doing the appropriate thing as well. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Masters of Innovation here on Evolve Now. I look forward to helping you on your journey towards becoming a true master of innovation. Feel free to reach out to me anytime with questions.